Thank you very much, Pam. I hope that you can see my screen.
Absolutely,
And
yeah.
Thank you, Casey. Great, good. Thank you, Casey, for that great introduction. A really nice summary of those key points around using and applying and benefiting from BIM. So my job this morning in the next 20 minutes is to give you a brief update on the international standards that are being developed to deliver the information management process, and then say a few words about how that is filtering through to the UKBIM framework that we have here in the UK governing our application of BIM. So my name's David Churcher. I run my consultancy, and I've been an author of some of the parts of ISO 19650. I'm also co-editor of the guidance that the UK BIM Framework has been publishing and that Casey referred to. And I'm also a UK BIM Alliance ambassador, like many people today, wearing a number of different hats. So let me just start by showing you the timeline that we've had for the development of 19650. And as you can see from the chart, it has been quite a long journey. And this is partly in the nature of developing international standards. They take a fair amount of time to develop, even at a national level. But when you're talking about international consensus from different countries with different points of view and different outlooks on life, then that consensus is, I think, even more difficult to achieve. But we have done it. And this is a series of parts of 19650 that have actually all been led by the UK. We provided all the baseline documents from our existing 1192 standards that many of you will be familiar with. We've had a chair and leader in Anne Kemp through pretty much all of that journey and carrying on into the future, which has provided great continuity and a really key focus for it. And the UK has provided all of the technical authors for the different parts of the ISO series. So we've been center stage on this, and hopefully that means we have an advantage in understanding what the ISO means, but also it means we've had a really good opportunity to engage the rest of the world with the way that we've been developing things here in the UK. So I'm just going to now step through briefly the three parts of the ISO that are still out there and waiting to be developed and published, parts 3, 4, and 5. ISO 19650 Part 3 is concerned with managing information during the operational phase of an asset's life. So it is the counterpoint to the project delivery phase, which is governed by 19650 Part 2. At the moment, this standard is in what is called Final Draft International Standard Form, FDIS, and there is a vote currently going on amongst the international community on whether to accept that final draft as the international standard. The vote closes in late June, as you can see, and after that we will then find out whether that vote is successful, and if it is, then the ISO will be published. We have great expectations as there was a vote on the previous draft which got unanimous approval. So fingers crossed we'll get something very similar this time round, and it'll all be plain sailing towards publication. At the moment, ISO is thinking to publish at the end of September, but it may actually be earlier than that if things move more quickly, which they sometimes do. When that happens, the ISO will be issued to adopted also by CEN, so the European standards body, and through CEN it will be issued to BSI, and BSI will then publish it in the UK as BSEN ISO 19650 Part 3. So that's probably hopefully going to be sometime in late October. When that happens, or very soon afterwards, then PAS 1192 Part 3 will be withdrawn, because these two standards will both be covering the same technical area, and that's not something that can happen. In terms of what the ISO Part 3 looks like, then it's going to look very different from the PAS that we currently have for a few more months. It is going to look very similar to the existing ISO 19650 Part 2. And I'll say a little bit more about that on the next slide. In particular, whereas PAS Part 3 was mainly geared towards the asset owner and operator in terms of the requirements, the ISO Part 3 is much more even-handed. It brings forward all of those requirements on the appointing party, but it now also supplements them with the requirements on the suppliers and providers of information, the lead appointed party and the appointed parties. Of course, the language has all been turned into 19650 consistent terminology. And there is not going to be a national annex for Part 3 in the UK. Any country adopting an ISO standard can supplement it with a national annex if they feel the need. We have one for ISO 19650 Part 2 in the UK, but of which we'll be hearing more later this morning. But there's not going to be one for Part 3. This is one area where the ISO becomes more complicated than Part 2. This diagram is the process map through the ISO standard. And those of you that are familiar with 19650 Part 2 may remember that there is an 8-step process numbered from 1 to 8, which guides the various users of the standard through the various activities they have to comply with. Some of them are at project level for ISO Part 2, and some of them are at appointment level. The same approach has been adopted in Part 3, and this is one reason why this standard looks so different from the PAS that is being superseded. The pathways through the process are also much more complicated than in Part 2. We have these multiple pathways. And the reason for that is that the approach to managing information when you are in operational asset use and maintenance is dependent on the manner in which the information is being acquired. So in some cases, information comes from items of work that can be foreseen and planned, and where the tendering and appointment of appointed parties, lead appointed parties and delivery teams, their mobilization can all happen in advance of the event that is going to give rise to the information. And that event might then be repeated. You can see this is line B in the upper part of the diagram. On the other hand, there are some activities which are not able to be foreseen. So here we can't actually plan for the work until the event has happened. So there, down at the bottom of the diagram, pathway C, we have to wait until the trigger event, which is the pentagon in the circles, wait until the trigger event happens, and then we know how to react to it. We can work out how to react to it. Those are two fundamentally different approaches to managing information and onboarding a team. There's a third pathway through the middle, which is the purchase or acquisition of an asset rather than the development and construction of it, which of course is a possible route to acquiring and having assets that need to be maintained. So that in itself is making Part 3 quite a complicated beast. Unfortunately, there's not time here today to go into it in detail. Perhaps that'll be the subject of a later conference when the standard is actually published later in the year. Let me move on to say something about Part 5, the Security Mindedness Standard. So this is a little bit ahead of ISO 19650 Part 3. It's gone through its vote on the final draft. That closed a couple of weeks ago, as far as we know, keeping my fingers crossed, that all got approved. And Alex Luck, who's the author of that standard, I believe is currently working on the proofs. So it is now moving towards publication. So maybe that end of August date might be brought forward a bit. Again, that when it's published by ISO will come down through CEN to BSI and then be published as the UK version, BS EN ISO 19650-5, and then PAS Part 5 will be withdrawn. But the perhaps the slightly easier message is that ISO Part 5 and PAS Part 5 are much more similar in their style and structure. So maybe less to get over in applying the new ISO standard. Again, the terminology is neutral and consistent with the rest of the 19650 series. And again, there is not going to be any national annex for Part 5. The diagrams in Part 5 have changed. They've been made more international, more neutral. There's a diagram on the left which illustrates the overall process for implementing security mindedness. Now, actually, I'm not sure this really existed in this form in the PAS. So this sort of high-level diagram showing how the triage process gives way to the development of an approach, the formulation of a strategy, and then the establishment of a security management plan, and then its implementation. That is a step-by-step approach that is then iterated round during the life of the asset. And on the right-hand side, the triage process, which was a key feature of PAS 1192 Part 5, is still there and is, as we see, the first step in the process. And the triage process actually is the same, although it looks a little bit different, in that it asks a number of yes/no questions, and the answers to those questions take the user down a pathway to reach one of 4 outcomes for security mindedness. Either ST4, which is the nothing special here, just ordinary commercial and personal data security needs to be applied, stepping up through ST3, 2 and 1, which require various levels of strategic outlining and then planning of security management and implementation to make sure that information is kept secure. So that is all, I think, very familiar to the current users of PAS 1192 Part 5, and there should be not very much to worry about in the application of this new standard. Moving briefly on to ISO 19650 Part 4. This is really only just started work late last year, early this year, being led by Nick Nesbitt, and quite a lot of work going on at the moment to develop an internal working draft within the working group. That is looking at the scope of the standard, which is covering the acceptance criteria for an information exchange. So it's much broader than the UK BS 1192 Part 4 standard, which deals with COBE. This is looking more generically at how do we accept and what criteria do we lay down to accept an information exchange. There's likely to be a sort of semi-internal draft being circulated around the national mirror committees later this year, maybe starting in the summer, to check that that's moving in the right direction, to get some feedback. That's not a public consultation, though. That's going to happen later on, probably 2021. And then that public consultation will give rise to hopefully a final draft, which then gets approved and published in 2022. Now, the scope of Part 4, as it is that bit different from the scope of 1192 Part 4, there's going to be a need to work out what happens with that COBI standard, and that has other considerations other than just the fact that a new standard is being developed. There's a discussion going on about COBI and whether or not it's a useful and meaningful standard to continue to be used in the UK. So all of those things will feed into what we do in a couple of years' time with that existing 1192 Part 4 when that new ISO emerges. Okay, now just in my final few moments, I want to say a few words about the BIM framework that we have here in the UK. This is the webpage, standards and guidance webpage from the BIM framework website. And on the left-hand side there, we have the list of standards that comprise the UK BIM framework. Of course, also on the right, we have all the links to the guidance that Casey has already mentioned, and which is being developed in an iterative way to support and help people implement those various standards, no matter what role or party they are playing in their asset life cycles. So let me just step through and summarize what's going to be happening to the UK BIM framework during the course of 2020. We know we already have parts 1 and 2 there, and we have that transition guide, which in the main are there to stay. But as I mentioned earlier, ISO 19650 Part 2 has a UK national annex that has currently been subject to some revision and is now out for consultation with the industry at large. And a speaker in a few moments will be saying a bit more about that national annex project. So that is going to give rise to a change potentially in the UK BIM framework. We don't know what the nature of that change is going to be until the content of that national annex has been finalized later on, hopefully this year. So that means that there will then be an amendment or an addition to the current 19650 Part 2 to incorporate any changes that are agreed for that national annex. PAS 1192 Part 5, currently part of the framework, is going to be withdrawn and will be replaced by ISO 19650 Part 5. That will happen hopefully later this summer, August, September time. PAS 1192 Part 3 is going to be withdrawn and replaced by ISO 19650 Part 3 later on this year as well, more towards the autumn. So that is also going to be a change that comes through by the end of the year. Apart from that, the BIM framework is remaining static for the next couple of years until 1192 Part 4 is merged or replaced by the new ISO Part 4 in 2022. And that leaves PAS 1192 Part 6 on health and safety and the 2 BS 8536 documents on briefing for design and construction. Those are intended to remain as UK national standards for the foreseeable future and will be part of the UK BIM framework as far as we can tell. So that BIM framework is of course going to evolve and in some parts, but other parts are going to be remaining national documents. They may still be subject to change, but of course that change is then entirely within our own UK control. So there is quite a lot going on in this year over the course of the standards and the BIM framework, and certainly this year and over the next couple of years that evolution will continue. The guidance will continue to be updated and expanded so that it gives you, the practitioners, the assistance that you need to put these new standards into practice. And in that regard, that the feedback that you give of how you're finding the application of the standards and the guidance is really vital. It helps us in the guidance team and in the UK BIM Alliance know how to help you to make sure that we as an industry and as a nation can all move forward into the new digital transformation world and benefit from it in all the ways that Casey was highlighting. So thank you very much. That's all I wanted to say. I know we have questions when we've had the next couple of speakers, so if you do have any questions for me, I'll be very happy to try and answer them when we get to that.
Thank you very much, David.
Thank you.
That was an excellent presentation. Thank you. So our next presenters are May Winfield and Simon Lewis, who will speak about making legal BIM business as usual. So over to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I'm hoping that my screen will pop up any second now. Perhaps somebody can tell me if it does. Is it there yet?
No, we can see your desktop, but not your presentation.
That's helpful, isn't it? Let me try again. How about that?
Yes, perfect.
Excellent. Okay. Well, yes, good morning, everyone. I sense the collective groan that the lawyers have arrived, but we're only here for 20 minutes and you get 2 for the price of 1. I'm Simon Lewis. I'm a partner in the construction team at Womble Bond Dickinson, but again, I'm here today wearing my other hat as Vice Chair of BIM for Legal. I've got 10 minutes to have a quick chat with you, and then I will be handing over to May Winfield. So I'm basically doing the first 2 points here, and then May will follow up with the other 2. So first, a little bit about BIM for Legal. BIM for Legal was formed back in 2018, following on from the publication of the Winfield Rock Report, which was something of a wake-up call, and we hope for the legal community that had not really, with a couple of notable exceptions, got to grips with the legal aspects of BIM, possibly because some saw it as essentially a technical schedule to the contract, whereas of course it is, I think, fairly uniquely an aspect that intertwines the legal and the technical. The purpose of BIM for Legal was to provide a forum for discussion and knowledge sharing on the legal aspects of information management and the development of legal and contractual documentation to assist in the information management process. Basically, if you like, to help to make the legal aspects of the information management process business as usual. It does raise the extraordinary prospect of lawyers actually cooperating with each other for a change, but we do. Those that come along do, and the sessions that we hold are always interesting, very informative, and everyone should come along, lawyer or not, if you possibly can. A couple of recent highlights there. We did a couple of presentations on the interaction of BIM and facilities management contracts, particularly in the context of asset information models and asset management systems and how they could be constructed. We did the first presentation on the use of BIM with FIDIC contracts, which currently don't cater for BIM to any significant degree. And we've been previewing the ISO 19650 Information Management Protocol, which May will be speaking about in a little more detail shortly. What I would like to do is to just set into context, if you like, the legal aspects of the protocol by reminding us of the guidance that Casey has already mentioned. The part 1 in particular, dealing with concepts and assisting in understanding the fundamental principles of building information modeling. the content obviously is deliberately high level to provide an overview, and I would certainly echo Casey's recommendation that if you're coming at this for the first time, this is an excellent introduction to the overall framework and structure of the information management under the ISO 19650 system. It's to be read in conjunction with part 2, which provides much more detailed process-driven guide with specific examples. The purpose is to facilitate the, as I say, the understanding of the information management system. Now, the legal aspects can be found in section 3, first of all, on page 17. I suppose it's worth pausing to say, well, why bother? What's the issue with legal aspects? Surely this thing will just sort of write itself. Well, of course, the answer is they won't. And as any lawyer will always tell you, it's important to make sure that the legal relationship between the parties, as contained within the agreement, is clear, that it covers everything that it should do, that it is legally binding and contains all of the basic necessary information, and importantly, uses the right terminology. This is something that you'll hear several times from us. Because of the development of terminology from the existing publicly available specification terminology to the ISO terminology, the underlying legal documentation has to change as well, and the purpose of the protocol is partly to deal with that. It is also covered in the guidance, as we'll see when looking at Annex C in a moment. The guidance stresses that the tasks relating to the management of information will of course change from project to project in their specifics, but overall the basic legal framework should be the same. And to my mind, the most important aspect of the legal framework, and really it's the case whether one's talking about information management or generally, is to make sure that it is clear as to deliverables, that at the end of the day, the purpose of the legal framework is to make sure that everyone involved in the project knows what they have to do, what they have to send to whom and when, at what level of information, and what they can expect the other party to the contract to do. Hence the need to get the framework right. There is an annex to the guidance which contains more detail on the legal aspects of the process. This is again quite high level, but it does provide a more process-driven approach to the legal aspects and mirrors the ISO 19650 Part 2 process. Again, useful table C1, have a look at it, provides a high-level guide to the equivalent terminology, moving from the PAS terminology to the ISO terminology. And in fact, paragraph C1 then defines the new ISO terms, so do have a look at that. It's to act as a high-level guide to establish the legal framework for the project's specific information protocol. And at the end of each section in the process, key actions are highlighted to make sure that at each stage, from the legal and contractual perspective, we know exactly what has to be done. And also, as I've said, the guidance is a good starting point. I certainly recommend it, and it acts as an introduction to the information protocol itself. And I'm now going to hand over to May to deal with that aspect. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Share my screen. So just making sure you can see the correct screen. Pam, can you see the
So
correct screen?
I can see your slides, but not in presentation mode. Still not in presentation mode.
Why is it not happening? Apologies. It's doing it on my screen, but not on yours.
You see, you need to change, going to your show screen in the go to webinar piece tab. That's it. Perfect.
Great.
It's working now.
Sorry. Thanks, Simon. Jess, I'm going to go through a bit about the protocol. I know a lot of people have been asking about it for the last year. We have been hard at work, and it's due for publication sometime around the end of this month or shortly in the beginning of next month. And BIM for Legal will be organizing with the Alliance some webinars and events to explain the contents, but just to give you a heads up. So one of the things we did is try to make it as user-friendly as possible. We're taking lessons learned from how people were using or not using the CIC BIM protocol to date. So as a result, we've taken out all the schedules. One of the reasons being in the various studies done about the protocol, it was found generally people weren't filling in the schedules or were filling in them incorrectly, which resulted in issues as to the legal enforceability of the protocol. So all you'll have to do is pick it up, put it in each of your contracts. The only thing you'll need to fill in is a cover page, which will just state where all the important documentation is, so the BEP, your EIR, and so forth. We are trying to make it as user-friendly as possible. So for those lawyers who vaguely know what BIM is, and for all of the people who have been using BIM extensively for many years, it works for everybody. There, as we all know, BIM is full of terminology and jargon, and when you say things like BIM according to the ISO 19650 series, sounds very exciting at first, but then you realize it doesn't actually mean anything from a legal and contractual perspective. So we have inserted a contractual clarification on that, as well as both ISO 19650 terms. You will find that there is a terminology and definition section, and some of the explanations go beyond what is contained in the ISO. And the reason for that is this is a contractual legal document. So some of the things need a bit more meat on the bones to work from a legal perspective. We have inserted, where relevant, the specific ISO 19650 obligations, so where they are meant to flow down specifically into contractual obligations. So things like establishing and maintaining a risk register, maintaining capability and capacity, who should be establishing the TIDP, the MIDP, what are various functions and tasks and who should do them. When you read the document, you will see that it's written in a way it's clear what is for the appointing party, what is for the lead appointed party, and what is for the other appointed parties. And so again, you won't need to cut and paste depending which party you are in the particular scenario. We've also taken the opportunity to kind of fix up and improve some of the things in the protocol to just take lessons learned. Obviously, when any document is written, it's not actually being used as yet, and you don't really know how people will interpret things until a couple of years after. So things like the Trent and Mott MacDonald case, we've filled that gap about the use of the CD. We've also done things like express an entitlement to claim time and costs for complying with the BIM obligation. So where it affects your scope or causes you to have additional time because the EIRs have been changed or the BEP has been developed over time, there is then an entitlement because there is a uncertainty on that as the way the protocol is written now. One thing I would say is that even if you are not being required to comply with the ISO 19650, the new protocol is can still be used with the PAS 1192, or indeed if you aren't required to comply with any of the standards at all, you would just need to amend it a bit to take out references, for example, to the ISO. It is trying to move things forward as regards how people deal with the legal and contractual issues of BIM. We've also inserted things like the GDPR, because that is, by its nature, you're handling a lot of electronic data, and people don't realize that GDPR comes into force. And bear in mind that your risk of penalties is quite substantial if there's a breach. So that's a very quick teaser of what's coming in the protocol. Once it's released, obviously, do feel free to contact any of us to give us your thoughts. I'm sure you will, and look out for the events. We're looking to have some events next month to give you a bit of explanation on how it works. But just to close, for the protocol to be effective and indeed for us to move forward in the matters of legal and contractual BIM and avoid disputes which are happening, we have to realize that legal BIM does matter, and you may need to push your legal advisors to take it seriously and to read up on the relevant sections to use the protocol. And why is that? Well, at the beginning of any relationship in projects, everyone's all loved up, everyone's in good spirits, and you're all going to hold hands and walk off into the sunset. However, when disputes happen, it's like the worst divorce in history. And so you go and try and work out what it was you agreed, because certainly what the other party is claiming isn't your recollection. And it looks more like this. So chances are your documentation, and certainly I've had many years of encountering boxes and boxes of files which are very disorganized. There's bits of notes on napkins, emails which are very vague, and it's not quite clear what it was you agreed to do. Because of that, it is important to make sure your documentation is clear at the outset, because if there is a query or discrepancy, disagreement, all you have to do is look at the documentation. It's clear who does what, who's responsible for what, and you just get on with things. You don't end up paying lawyers to argue the point, and let's face it, no one wins in that circumstance except the lawyers. And so we would, if anyone can help us to progress implementing the protocol particularly with clients, and encouraging client bodies to have a look at it, and government bodies, we would be very grateful for your help, because that was one of the issues with the CIC BIM protocol. It just wasn't very widely used by clients. You'll find our contact details there. If you would like updates on BIM for Legal, if you would like to offer to speak at one of our events, it would be obviously virtual events for now, we would very much welcome your thoughts, because the more we can increase knowledge, particularly in the legal community, the better it is for everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, May and Simon. That was excellent. Our next presenter is Dan Rossiter, who will speak about ISO 19650 National Annex. So over to you, Dan.
Thank you, Hidil. Good morning, everyone. I will assume my correct screen is on, unless anyone says otherwise. For those of you who don't know, I am Dan Rossiter, sector lead at the British Standards Institution. Like many who have spoken today and will speak later, I also have many hats. I'm a chartered architectural technologist. I sit on several of the BIM, CEN and ISO working groups to develop the standards. I'm an ambassador for the UKBIMA Alliance, co-chair for the Wales region, and generally try to help and stick my oar in wherever possible. As part of this presentation, it's more or less broken into two halves. The first is some of the technical rules around regional and national annexes. And the second half focuses on the 19650 Part 2 National Annex. Hopefully the idea is that for those of you who are attending the Great National Annex debate that the UKBIMA Alliance is having, hopefully this will help inform some of the things that you can and can't have in a national annex to help streamline some of those conversations, as well as highlight some of the good work that's been done to try and revise and improve that national annex. So start off then focusing on the idea of these regional and national annexes. As David Churcher mentioned earlier in his talk, the idea is that there is a hierarchy to the standards. We won't worry about the kind of the teal ones at the bottom for now. We'll focus on the red ones, and this idea that when a PAS is produced, often they are produced with an idea of grander things. And for those of you who remember the Bew-Richards maturity diagram, or colloquially known as the BIM wedge, it always had ISO on the pathway. And the idea was that we were creating these PAS documents, testing new ways of working, so that then they could be incorporated into ISO. And as you can see here, the route is that when we produce things like PASs, they could become national standards or they can go up to ISO. And then once they become an ISO standard, they can then be adopted within CEN as a region within Europe, and then further adopted into the UK. So there's a nice proliferation of these standards to ensure that there's a one world, one standard methodology, which is what we're trying to maintain as much as possible. From a technical point, the way that it breaks up normally, and this is for say 95% of instances, is that an ISO standard will have the following areas in them: forwards, introductions, scopes, normative references, terms and definitions, the main bits being the clauses and subclauses, and then finish with annexes and bibliographies. What you can see here is I've color-coded it into what are normative elements, which are the ones that need to be conformed with to claim conformity. And then you have the informative elements, which are the useful supplementary elements. We heard earlier from Simon and May about the fact that there needs to be clear agreements and clarifications in the contract. This is one area in particular in that by stating you follow a standard, it's assumed, at least from a BSI point of view, that you're following the normative elements. So clarifications will be needed if you are following additional informative bits. Now, from ISO, it then gets adopted as potentially a regional standard within CEN. What happens there is that a CEN wrapper effectively is placed onto it, where there is a regional forward and potentially a regional annex. They don't have to be added. They're added if they're needed or need to explain any supplementary things. For example, they can point to relevant standards that might be at the European level but not available internationally. They might point to certain EU directives that are relevant in this situation, particularly if you look at things like Eurocodes and other areas. This is where that becomes a lot more relevant in those sorts of areas, and generally tend to point at these additional bits and pieces. And then once it's in Europe, the idea then is that it can be adopted nationally. So then we, as the UK, are able to put our own wrapper on top. And the idea then is that we can present that with a national forward and a national annex as part of that process. Now, you'll notice that the forwards and annexes in this situation are almost always informative. There are a few exceptions for things like Eurocodes and when they relate directly to regulations, but otherwise in most situations, annexes are informative. They help support following the main body of the standard, the clauses and sub-clauses themselves. And the idea is that there are rules in terms of drafting these things. The idea is that an annex, if informative, includes recommendations, guidance, or statements. It can't include new provisions. It can't add extra clauses onto the standard. You'll notice when reading the National Annex for 19650 Part 2, it puts a clarification which says this is the clause it's looking at, and then underneath it, it adds additional recommendations and guidance. And that's because it's focusing on clarifying and adding additional informative text to support those clauses. It's not changing the way the standard performs. If you were to add a clause in that was an alternative way of doing something, or a clause that is to the contrary of what's written, that's not permitted from an ISO point of view, because then you're dealing with a very different standard instead of supporting the international standard that's been produced. And generally the idea is that you should follow the same drafting rules. So the idea being that the language should be consistent, the formatting and styling should be, so that it appears as part of the standard to aid with readability and to aid with the usability of these standards by others. And from a simple point of view, which is further supported within BS0, which is the standard for standards. Yes, we do have one of those. And the idea is that we shouldn't modify or supplement the standard, which is, again, goes back to that same idea that what we're doing is we're making it clearer, or we're adding additional guidance and support, not changing the way that that standard behaves. A lot of this is normally done through the different verbal forms that we use. So a lot of you will read standards, and quite often you'll either see it say shall if it's a specification, or should if it's a code of practice as part of those processes. And those are normally the two normative forms that things take. However, when writing a specification, you can use should to mean something informative at that point, so you're able then to fully clarify different bits as well. And you can see there are other phrases that can be used. You should never use must. It's not really permitted, nor is will, because of how ambiguous that they are as part of this process. So when writing a national annex and creating that text, you're limited to only use really the informative forms, which means that you're limited effectively to should, may, can, might, and is, which helps bring the language down a little. But you can't, for example, say that someone shall do something because you added an additional provision to that standard and you're now starting to change how it behaves. So it's just trying to make sure that we can control and manage what we are looking at effectively. I see, I think Fiona's managed to steal the screen from me.
Not deliberately, sorry.
Aha. That's right, thank you. Yeah, so there are a number of forms and stuff that take place there. So specifically when we start talking, I think just before I go on then, the point I will make also is that what, as David mentioned, there is no national annex for Part 3 or Part 5. and that is largely due to the fact that it's seen that there isn't a need to add these additional guidances and clarifications in there, which I think largely to do with the fact that the seed documents used were of UK origin, PAS 1192.3 and 1192.5 respectively, and the fact that we had our UK authors. It's meant that actually a lot of the content we wanted to put in and gain international consensus on was accepted. So there wasn't a need to bolt on a wrapper to explain these additional bits. So moving on and focusing on the National Annex for 19650 Part 2. The way that the National Annex is currently set up is that it clarifies the following subclauses. There's clarifications around key decision points, the unique ID and the fields that should be used as part of a identification system, the different fields that should be used for coding within such a naming convention, how things like status, revision and classification should be handled, and the expected level of information to be exchanged. Now, one of the important things to note is that this isn't all the National Annex needs to cover. One of the things that we can get focused on sometimes is commenting on what's there as opposed to commenting on what isn't there. And effectively, the Annex could clarify any of the clauses and subclauses in the standard. So as opposed to being a reductive strategy where we're taking out bits we don't like, we actually could propose as part of the debate and comments going in new things that need to be clarified as well. So just to say that this isn't a fixed list that we are dealing with. As part of dealing with key decision points, it recommends looking at the work stages within BS 8536 Parts 1 and Part 2. As part of dealing with the unique ID, it looks at the recommended fields and what the delimiter should be as part of that process. There are standardized codes being placed into the Annex as recommendations of what to follow. And again, for status and revision, it's doing the same with standardized codes and points towards Uniclass 2015. And the idea that as default, it's recommending open formats, and there's an expectation potentially around the use of things like IFC and COBE to help add that kind of UK sphere of influence back onto the document in areas where international consensus couldn't be reached. Now, the current draft that's available for public consultation has got a number of changes proposed in it. It changes some of the names of some of the fields while keeping the way that they perform the same. So the idea that the volume and system field is renamed to system, the level and location field renamed to spatial. There's been an overhaul of the standardized type codes, the idea that role becomes discipline and the alignment for some of those codes, the revision to some of the status codes and some clarifications on how classification shall work. Now, I'm not going to go into all of these on today's web call. So instead, what I want to do is point to an excellent article John Ford wrote, which is available on LinkedIn, and I'm sure it's been retweeted and shared by many of us. So I suggest to read that for a fuller set of information. But what I'll do is focus on the type code as part of this conversation today. So one of the problems we had with the existing National Annex was that the type codes did lots of different things. Some of the codes were describing content. There was a code for surveys where, survey isn't really a type of information, it is the information. You do a survey and that's what you get. Some of them were forms of information like schedules, specifications, reports, or some of them were specific types of information like a schedule of accommodation. So what they meant is that there was an imbalance in the existing codes whereby there was only one drawing that was available, but there were multiple different report-based documents. And the idea was to try and rationalize what we were doing there. One of the ways to look at it, and if those of you have seen it, is Emma Hooper's presentation around the facets of information. I've pinched an image from Emma's presentation on the right with permission. And you can see the idea here that you can break information down into its content, its function, its form, and its format. And the idea as part of this revision is to shift the type codes to focus more on the form that information takes. An additional point that I will make is that looking at other standards we have in BSI's portfolio, there are standards on things like metadata for document management, which allows you to more refinedly describe a document's type. So what you'd be able to do, for example, is have the form to be described, such as schedule in this example here, and that the document type could then actually say the exact type of schedule it is, so that these standards can complement each other and have a wider list of metadata to support whoever's needs as part of this process. So there are a number of things that can be done in there. And in the same way, the form could be the drawing, while the document type could be a general arrangements drawing, meaning that there are existing resources that are already out there to help support the way that we can make all of this work together. Another bit I just wanted to touch on was the status codes and what are being proposed as part of that. Now, quite simply, a number of them haven't been touched. So in the way that the revisions are looking at, it's only really a few codes that are being looked at, which are S4 up to S7. Notably, before we didn't have an S5 in the National Annex. It was shown as withdrawn, which has caused some confusion. And while I've not seen the evidence firsthand, I have heard tales of people actually using S5 to indicate documents that have been withdrawn, as opposed to believing that it was a withdrawn status code. So to resolve some of those issues, it's been kind of reset effectively, and as opposed to using some codes which appeared to overlap slightly, the idea now is that the status codes more closely align to the 19650 process in part 2. So that, if I can just go back for a second, if you have something that's going to be checked for internally within a task team, it starts at S0. Once it's become shared, if it needs to be authorized, it goes through S4. And if it needs to be accepted, it goes through S5. So there's hopefully a more logical route to explain how that flow works that ties much closer to the specification in 19650 Part 2. And just to say, and as part of the whole thing that's happening, is that there is a debate, and the fact that as part of that debate, there's an opportunity to present comments. So as part of that, you can go to our standards development site, and you can submit comments onto the standard to make sure that you do have your say. As I understand it, through the UKBIMA Alliance, there'll be a coordinated set of comments that are being developed. But personal comments are always welcomed as well. And to finish off my presentation, I've got some top tips on how to comment as part of that process. The first is to think about what else should be included. As I mentioned earlier, it's not just about commenting on what's there, it's about commenting on what else is needed. So long as it follows the requirement I talked about earlier, it doesn't change what the standard is doing, and that what you're doing is clarifying and or supporting existing clauses in the ISO. Other things can be included in the National Annex. So it's important to reflect about what could we add to create additional value and to help others follow the standard. What we want to make sure is that comments are clear and include actionable changes. If you just put in a comment that says this is rubbish, then there's actually nothing that the committee can do to fix that, because all you've said is that it's bad, but you haven't proposed how to improve it. All comments are welcome, but they should be constructive, just explain how a change can be done to achieve the result that you want. You'll notice that when you submit comments, there's a box for your comment and a box for proposed change. Making sure that that comment is clear and that that change is actionable really helps the committee look at it, consider it, to make sure that actually it's something that could be incorporated if possible. It's also important to comment on things that you like as well as things that you don't. This is something that I know that Anne is quite passionate about, and it's a real problem that if everyone thinks something is brilliant and then 3 people comment and say, no, it's rubbish, it needs to be changed, it could look like that just by accepting what's there without commenting could cause something to be changed. So it's going to be very helpful to be able to comment and say, actually, what are the things that work well that shouldn't be changed, as much as saying what needs to be changed. And finally, read the existing comments before adding your own. As part of this, then, if you want to support or add additional comments onto someone else's, then brilliant. But what will happen is that as part of the process, those comments will get aggregated together. So to make it more helpful and support the way the discourse is being done over the standard, it's helpful to look at what's already been commented, and if your comment is the same as someone else's, then it's already been said, or if they haven't said it in a clear enough way, then comment and add in the additional bits to say that you support what's been said, and then add your qualifier as needed. And that's really it from me.
Thank you very much, Dan. That was excellent. So our next speaker is Fiona Moore from the Centre of Digital Britain, and this presentation will be about the BIM interoperability report. So over to you, Fiona.
Thank you very much. Sorry for interrupting, Dan. Apologies for that. I'm trying to let you see me because I actually bothered to wear makeup today, so really keen because I made the effort. The BIM Interoperability Expert Group report, we've completed the consultation on it. So as such, I'd hope that the majority of you have had a chance to look at it. But the purpose today is to just give you some background, explain what the evidence gathering that we've carried out to date, the recommendations, and what we plan to do next. So it's a piece of work which is funded by the Construction Innovation Hub, of which CDBB is part, and I'm an information management consultant who's engaged by CDBB to carry out this and other related work. And really it came out of the conversation that was had back in October, where I was giving a presentation on BIM to a number of people who are part of government. And I said, this is the theory, the practice is sometimes different. When it came to information exchange, information requirements, the client being able to procure information and purpose it, a whole conversation started up around interoperability and its practical application and our ability to achieve the benefits of information management. So I was challenged, and I and others, and Anne Kemp was pivotal in this as well, with putting together some evidence gathering. So we went out to a number of experts and we posed some very simple questions. So the questions we asked were, how are you, or the industry as a whole, currently achieving or providing the means for information/data openness and interoperability? So it's a move from the strategic process standards driven oversight of BIM into its practical application. Somebody sat at a desk who's challenged to do something. We wanted to hear back from individuals as to what it looked like, what could be achieved with the tools that are out there. So hence we asked, what problems do you encounter, or does the industry encounter when currently delivering or providing the means to deliver interoperable data? So how are you doing it? But what are the blockers? Where are you hitting the buffers? Then we moved on to a slight look ahead, but I'll underline the word slight. So what do you think could be used to deliver interoperable data in future? Please consider a time frame of up to 5 years only. So it's the here and now. What are we trying to deliver now, and how can we achieve it? And what change needs to happen to achieve interoperability going forward? Now, we probably should have said in that question, 5 years only, please, because a number of people have a tendency to look ahead because they're excited and enthused. And because we're CDBB, a lot of people assume that the question is related to the larger picture. around the digital twin, the national digital twin. But again, we're looking at the here and now. So thank you very much to the individuals who provided us with evidence. You see a list there and you can see it in the report. And I'd highly recommend that when you read the report or revisit the report when it's finally published post-consultation, that you do look at the appendix. It's a summary of the evidence received. The evidence, each of those evidence providers, and there were 21 in total, with the exception of 2 who provided written evidence, presented in person for a total of 15 minutes, i.e. 25 minutes presentation and then 25 minutes Q&A. We transcribed everything that was said. We can't share the full transcripts, but we did summarise the transcripts, and it was a really robust and thorough process. And we've come out in the draft report that's gone out to consultation with a series of recommendations. Now, the recommendations, as you see there, are not fully detailed. We haven't said what we're going to do under each of those recommendations, but we've said, having heard the evidence, these are the areas that need to be addressed. And we've split them into primary recommendations and secondary recommendations on the basis that they were argued most strongly, most convincingly, and mentioned by the vast majority of those providing evidence. And again, you know, we've got a lot of information to back that up. But we're very conscious that we didn't get out to all experts and the whole of industry, hence the consultation process we've gone through more publicly. And I have to be honest, the responses we've had back have been very helpful and informative and will inform the next steps. So those are the recommendations there you see in front of you. And what we've done in order to manage this as a piece of work going forward is to turn those into a series of work streams, which you'll now see on the screen. So to go through those work streams, classification and schema alignment speaks for itself. Obviously, we're applying those elements of classification that appear in the UKBIM framework that are applied in the current standards. What came up time and time again is government clients especially asking for COBE, how to achieve COBE, the necessary use of industry foundation class, and its practical application and development. So there was a lot of discussion about model view definitions, the maturity of them, the development of them. Almost every evidence provider mentioned education and skills. And I'm an architectural technologist by training. I was managing BIM projects back in 2011, 2012. And my constant refrain, because I'm not half as technically able as a lot of people who are part of today's virtual meeting, where's the COBE button? You know, do I need to really get into the back end of this software to make it work? Where's the easy user interface? I can understand the first principles, but I really have to be that skilled in the computer application itself. So education skills is a big work stream, but what I will remind everybody when they're looking at the work that we're developing, that it's education and skills related to interoperability only. CDVB has a wider work programme which is around engagement, education and skills. Standards, well, everything we do, you just heard Dan speak, has to be related back to standards, and we need to be kept on the straight and narrow. Another big one, because this is very much endorsed by government, by Cabinet Office, IPA, and across the whole plethora of government departments, is the client perspective on the common data environment, the asset information model, and how we achieve interoperability so that information can pass across the contract line from the supplier to the recipient. Increasingly, major government procurers are seeing the information that's delivered to them as much as an asset as the actual built asset itself. So it's a really important work stream. Standard data approach if you look at the report, we captured the need to address this issue, but I don't think we properly articulated it. And in the final revised edition, we'll be addressing the standard data approach and what we mean by it in more detail. All I can say at the moment to those of you who, as part of the consultation, raised the issue of product data and data dictionaries, that's where that piece of work sits. Having noted that, that piece of work is being carried out by others, and I don't know how many of you are aware of the work that BRE are carrying out under the Construction Innovation Hub to get the lexicon work across the line. I'll speak to Pam separately as to whether we can share some of that working out with you. But it's very key to make sure that we have the right stakeholders involved in this work, but it's not work I'm directly involved in. And then another big issue is procurement and contracts. It comes up time and time again. It's all very well having this process, but how do we ensure that the process is properly applied when we contract? And I think that isn't just about making sure that we have the right BIM contractual documents, but it's also making sure that those in the procurement world, that procurement professionals understand the importance of it, are bought into it, and will be using the new protocol appropriately, and so on and so forth. So I can't say strongly enough how much of this is about key messaging. But just briefly go back to the previous slide, that you'll see that there are a few things there: drivers and enablers, GUID, operational focus, product data templates, which are now being amalgamated into that standard data approach, and APIs. Those have not been left behind. What you see now in terms of the work streams and the next step is what we're going to put into the early program. So what we're doing at the moment is onboarding some practical resource to look at each of these work streams, to start to consider what we need to deliver so that we can write a program of work over at least the next financial year and then beyond. So at the moment we're combining some expertise to start to look at how we scope some really practical applied work. And the one thing I can say to you as the UK BIM Alliance, and all of you having a vested interest in this, is we won't go away and do some work in the huddle and then share it when we've finished. There will be very regular updates. I'm talking to CDBB at the moment about how we communicate what we're up to very regularly. I see this work as being very agile. A lot of people have said, what is the scope of this work? We're developing it. It will evolve. It will evolve to respond to the consultation we've had to date and the sort of feedback we get from people like yourselves on a regular basis. So I'm hoping you'll find that really useful. That's a bit of a rush through. I'm under time, but there's no point in me adding to that. I would recommend that you do look at the report. Unfortunately, the consultation period is now closed, but as I say, there will be plenty more opportunity to become stakeholders in this piece as well. Thank you.
All right, that was excellent, Fiona. Thank you very much. We now have a few more minutes to add to the question and answers. So I would like to invite the panel to join to answer a few questions. And I'll start by answering a common question about the slides. So yes, the slides will be shared where the presenters have permitted sharing. And also you can follow the UK BIM Alliance YouTube channel where the video recording of this conference will be available next week. About links, you can click the links from the slides that will be shared, but also please follow the Twitter page of the UK BIM Alliance, as we're tweeting about this and sharing some of the links that are being mentioned in the slides. So to start with the first question, is BIM Level 2 still the terminology to be used, as BIM Level 2 is stated in UK government documentation, or is this to be changed by UK government? So over to the panel, if you'd like to answer this one, please.
Can I
Yes,
Can I
May.
answer that first?
Yes, please.
One thing to bear in mind is that level 2 is in essence a made up expression in the sense that it's referred to in the PAS 1192 documentation but has no meaning. And I'd refer you to interested people to the Winfield Rock report on that and various other documentation. So parties are able to say whatever they want in the documentation. You could say level A. It doesn't have a specific meaning unless you define it. And I'm talking from a legal and contractual perspective. Obviously, from a technical perspective, there is a PAS 1192. And I do appreciate, obviously, the PAS has been withdrawn and people shouldn't be using the level 2 expression. And I completely support that. But it's not, unlike things that have a force of law, there isn't actually technically anything that is stopping people.
Yeah, maybe if I can just add to that, thank you, May. Yes, I mean, BIM level 2 was the useful shorthand that was used to represent that series of standards and processes around the government mandate. It has now been is being replaced by the UK BIM Framework. So that is the new equivalent phrase. But again, it's just a phrase, it's just a name. And we define it in terms of those standards that were listed in my presentation and are on the UK BIM Framework website. But that's really the only definition that there is. The old language of level 2 will still persist in documents that haven't been updated. And sometimes there's good reason for them not being updated. If you're in the middle of a long-term project, is it really necessary to go through and change all of your references? Probably not, provided everyone knows what things are meant. So you still expect to see level 2 around for a bit, but hopefully increasingly see UK BIM Framework as the phrase.
Could I just add to what you both said? I would fully endorse what May's saying about, it was a bit of a construct that was never really fully defined, and a lot of lazy procurers use level 2 as a shorthand. I think as we mature and we improve our understanding of BIM from a client perspective, then generally the way they procure should improve, but hence the whole work stream under interoperability around contracts and procurement. There will be a move increasingly, as David said, towards reference to the new ISO and potentially UK BIM framework. But what I'd really like to see happening in contracts is better exchange information requirements and some real detail rather than this lazy shorthand reference to general BIM deliverables. But as David said, it's very hard for a lot of large client organisations to make these changes overnight, not only if it's a long-term project, but also on frameworks, where actually changing terminology and frameworks is seen by those procurers as pretty problematic. But that's one I know May and David and I could debate.
Yes.
Right, thanks very much. So the next question is about the Find Your Place quote that has been presented earlier. This is from a professional looking to be ready or fit for companies to be hired in a BIM environment. So he's asking, what do you believe is the best action to be competitive in this market? Providing companies the model of professional they would like to employ, learning a particular software because that may not look very productive since each company uses different approaches. So what's your recommendation for professionals looking to enter the BIM world?
I think I'll take that one, Hadiel. I've replied to it in the comments, so hopefully people should be able to see that. But yeah, so thank you for the question. It really does depend on what type of professional you are as to how you would make yourself the most appropriate to be seen as a professional in a BIM working process. So there are many varied different routes to to demonstrating that. But what I suggest is, if you, it does really depend on what role you're playing, but read the guidance documents, find out what role you play within that process, as a typical day's work now, how that might be different in a BIM way with reference to the ISO standards. Then seek training if you need it. There's very many self-trained people doing their own research, or there's official courses. There are certification schemes that are available, but we do really need to make sure that that people are learning in the right way, and there is some work coming up on a refresh of various different learning outcome frameworks and things like that, along with new certification schemes. But people need to understand that you have understood the BIM process at a certain level, then practiced it in reality on projects, delivering real projects, and demonstrate that experience. So it's certainly not an overnight thing. It's about finding what's relevant to you, understanding that, and then just being good at that role. It's what we're not looking for is someone to be an expert in absolutely everything. That's really unachievable. But we do want people to be very good at what they would normally do, but in a BIM environment.
Excellent advice, thank you. All right, so we'll move on to the next question. The PAS 1192 part 3, when it's withdrawn, this means it shouldn't be used anymore, because there are some confusion around the PAS series being used after the correspondence 19650 has been published.
Yes, I think this was directed at me. Sorry, David here. That is true. That when a national standard is withdrawn in deference to an international standard, then it should not be used anymore. But a little bit like Fiona was saying in relation to the BIM level 2 piece, these are very difficult things to make happen overnight, or even over the course of a year or more, particularly where there are sort of long-term arrangements in place that have been set up under the old regime and need to be either adapted and amended for the new regime, or you just play both, sort of run both horses for a period of time. And I suspect this is going to happen. It's happened a bit with PAS 2 and BS 1192 2007. Those have been withdrawn, and yet they are, as the question notes, that there are still instances where they're being referred to. Some of that might be this historic sort of inertia, and maybe some of it is ignorance, but hopefully less and less. So there is a communications aspect to this to make sure that people understand that the new standards have been published, and BSI does as good a job as it can to publicize, to make people aware of what's happened. And the Alliance and CDBB are also doing those sort of similar messaging pieces. So it is unfortunately a fact of life, but yes, if a standard is withdrawn, then it should no longer be being actively used or referred to.
Yeah, so just to build on that, is that our role at BSI is to, this will probably do it short and I'll get told off by a marketing person, but it's to disseminate good practice. And the idea is that what we present in our standards and in our other resources, like our training and certifications, etc., is related to what is current good practice. And at the point where 19650 Part 3 is released, the good practice around information management using building information modeling during the operational phase of an asset is no longer the contents of PAS 1192.3. It is within 19650 Part 3. So to not confuse people, not to have multiple ways of doing something, because we want a one world, one standard sort of model, that's why that content gets withdrawn and the new things take over. Just to say that this is not a unique thing that happens in BIM. Under asset management, we had PAS 55 that turned to ISO 55000. ISO 9001 was a British standard, although I can't remember the actual number. It's one of the few I forget. So, you know, this process is evolving because our thinking and the way that we work evolves. So you'll see other standards and, you know, will be withdrawn and replaced all across the shop, because that's how we make sure that we present good practice to you guys.
Excellent, thank you. So the next question is around COBE. So will ditching COBE make some employing parties lose trust in BIM? It may be best to simply change it from Excel to coded output within the BIM software, as most have already done so using IDE. I don't think we've spoken about ditching COBE, but I'll leave it to you guys to answer.
I think somebody's asked the question because I raised COBE as one of the work streams.
Yes.
Basically, it is still a contractual requirement to provide COBE, but as part of that work stream, we'll be discussing not just with industry experts, but with procurers and clients who are inheriting COBE, the best way forward. A lot of clients at the moment are looking at their AIM CDEs, those who are more mature, and basically the conversation has to be around interoperability and how we best achieve deliverables that can provide benefit and function. So I can't answer that question, but that question could be posed as part of the work addressed by the work stream. In fact, I would suggest it would be.
Okay, thank you, Fiona. So while we're on that point, another question is actually to you. You mentioned that there's a number of work streams. So how do we get involved in these?
So at the moment, we're onboarding resource, and then we'll be looking at how we engage with individuals as stakeholders. So watch this space. As part of that agile approach and the necessary communication and engagement we'll be undertaking, there'll be ample opportunity to provide wider expertise and experience and inform those work streams. So currently being worked out. I mean, this work only started before Christmas, so I'm really happy that it's progressed as far as it has, but there's a long way to go. We're currently writing up terms of references, getting leads for the work streams engaged, and then there'll be a lot of work to make sure that we build on industry-wide expertise, and I'd welcome this sort of platform to continue to take the work forward. Sorry, that was a bit of a politician's response, wasn't it? But watch this space.
All right, excellent. Thank you very much, Fiona. So there is another question about, again, about the level 2 terminology. It says that the government procurement policy still specifies BIM level 2. So are the UK BIM Alliance doing anything to change this?
Can I respond? I chair the ISO transition cross-government working group. I'd be interested to know which government documentation, and again, you know, provide us with feedback. It's an evolving situation. I refer you to David, mine and May's answer previously.
Sorry, can I just jump in there and reiterate? Certainly agree with all the points that Fiona, David and May have made, and this also goes back to that comment I made about deliverables and clarity. It's always been the case and always will be the case, whether or not we're dealing with BIM information management or contracts that don't involve it, that you as lawyers will always tell you, you have to be clear about the parties' obligations and about the risk allocations across the contracts. And whether it's called level 2 or stage 2 or anything else, the important point is to be clear about what each party has to do, whatever you decide to call it. I mean, that's the really important point.
Okay, thank you very much for answering. Thank you to all of our panelists and speakers for their contribution, and we will aim to answer the remaining